Hi everyone, thanks for being with me. It's Tony Tonkin here. I'm going to talk today about child protection, and child protection particularly in the light of being a social worker, and what does it mean to be a social worker who has some knowledge and experience working in the child protection space. I have been working within child protection for over a decade now, as an outsider, if you like, someone who works independently as a private practitioner, who advocates and supports families, parents and children in relation to their encounters with the child protection system. What have I learned over this time, and why is it important to talk about it now? The time has come for there to be significant change within the child protection system. And I guess what I could say fairly is that that system has needed to change for decades. That no matter what we do, no matter how many chief executive officers we have, no matter how we raise objection to this system, the system still remains the same. So what is the problem? Why is it that we have a system that seems to not function as perhaps it should, in terms of caring for children, making sure that the best possible outcomes are provided for children and their families? Why is it that we have a number of deaths occurring amongst children who have been known to the child protection system? Why is it that we keep failing children and families in the way that we do? This has been occurring for decades. And it's time that we start to look at the real reasons why this system has been unable to change. There have been many solutions offered to change the child protection system. One of them has been to fund the system more appropriately, to look at particularly early intervention, and to be able to provide families with a level of support that they needed in order to be able to manage their family life a little differently, to be able to address the issues which concern child protection departments. This clearly has failed. Many years ago, there was a program called Keeping Families Together. This is about 25 years ago now. Now, that was a great program because it offered assistance for families within their homes, within their environments, and it provided social workers for those families who could work with them on a daily basis at the critical times when families were needing that help. That is, getting the kids up in the morning, around tea time, getting kids to school, dealing with the issues that sit between parents. All those issues were addressed through Keeping Families Together. It was called the Home Builders Program, and it came, I think, from Boston in the US. However, it failed. It failed probably for a number of reasons. Number one, it was expensive. Too expensive, it appears, to be able to continually being funded. And it didn't probably have the range of social workers or help, I guess, that these families specifically needed. However, ostensibly, it was a good program. It was dealing with at-risk families, and it helped to be able to maintain some of those families so that the children were not removed. We don't have similar programs to that today, in reality. We have some programs being offered that I guess may have some similarities, but certainly not at the level at which KFT committed to working with families. It doesn't seem to matter how much money we toss at the program. No matter how many billions of dollars are spent, the problems still remain. So when departments talk about additional resources, there may be some truth to that, in that they don't have enough people. The problem is not necessarily about the quantity of people. It's more about the quality of the people that they have. If you wish to work in this system, you need to understand the qualities, the skills that are required to be an efficient social worker within the child protection system. I've advocated for years that you need to be a counsellor, a mediator, a person who understands conflict resolution. You need to be able to understand the nuances of domestic violence, mental health issues, child sexual abuse, including drug and alcohol use. The expanse of knowledge and information that you need is extensive. It is unrealistic to expect that people who have just left university will have that knowledge. However, it also needs to be acknowledged that the people that are being employed are those fresh social work students. They do not have the skills to be able to implement appropriate programs and to work appropriately with the families that they're working with. There are some great social workers working within the child protection system. It isn't that they're not there. It is more about whether or not those people firstly can acquire the skills that are required to do the job appropriately, and whether or not they have got the authority to be able to make decisions based on best practice. A social worker, for example, must be able to engage with the family. Now, if you have a large caseload, and then perhaps we need to define what a large caseload is, which could be anything up to maybe 30 families that they're working with. If we consider that within those 30 families, there's a group of other people, 2, 3, 4 people perhaps within those families, we're looking at over 100 people that a social worker would be expected to be working with in order to rectify the issues that have brought the family to the view of the child protection system in the first place. It is not possible for anyone, no matter their skill set, to work effectively with that many people and expect an appropriate outcome. What are the numbers that social workers should be working with? Now, I would suggest that they should be no more than 10, because from 10 you could have somewhere around 30 or 40 people just within that number of 10 that you have to work with. Now, think about this for a moment. You have a mum and a dad, often, who are concerned to the department. So you need to find the skill set to work with the mum and the dad. You need to take time out to learn who these people are, to understand where they've come from. You need to be able to develop a working relationship with them. You need to find the space in order for them to feel safe and comfortable with you as the worker. Now, that rarely happens. The system is designed to seek to identify and to articulate the deficits that sit within each individual. The focus is always on identifying those deficits, highlighting them to the parent. They don't have much guidance in relation to how to do that, primarily because the workload, number of people they have to work with, and also the lack of skills. Firstly, we need to change the culture. The culture within the child protection system is such that the person who is working with the families, in whatever capacity that is, has very little power or authority to be able to advocate for that family. What the manager or supervisor will see will be the documentation that's been written about the children, about the family, about the parents, about the children, and that documentation, which is usually based on notifications and some interviews, will often determine a deficit version of who they are. Families are not just that deficit version. Families are filled with nuances about their past, about the things that have affected them as children themselves, and eventually about how they've managed their relationships with other adults. We need to therefore find ways to work differently with the families. One of those ways is to make sure that people are supervised more appropriately. Many social workers, I think, that become involved in the child protection system often find themselves lost. They are looking to others for guidance. Those people providing that guidance are usually entrenched in this system, multiple cases, being able to look for what is wrong with the parent, hammering the parent about the issues which concern the department, and spending very little time understanding who the families are and who the parents are in particular. There's also pressure placed on supervisors and managers to have cases move through the system as soon as possible. Once a child is removed or the department has become involved, they will organise a safety plan, which sometimes may mean that the children could stay with them under certain conditions. And that safety plan is reviewed continually, and once a family contravenes that safety plan in any particular way, the children then are removed. An assessment is done after the children are removed, which normally sits for about 3 months. That process means that they'll look at all the deficits that they can find in relation to the family, and that there's very little time to work with and to understand who the family are during that period. Again, because of the caseloads, and also because the lack of skills that are required in order to do that appropriately. An assessment is made through psychologists, psychiatrists, and other people who may interview the family for maybe an hour and a half, and create, based on the information they've had before, as given to them by the department, and an hour and a half interview as to who these people are and whether or not they can parent their children appropriately. This system, this assessment process, is inadequate. It's also important to point out, I think, that we need to disengage with attachment theory. That there are many different views of attachment theory, but attachment is used as a tool against parents. Completely inappropriate, and certainly not what John Bowlby initially had intended back in the 50s. It's outdated, it's outmoded, and I'll often hear social workers say to me, well, we're going to focus on what's best interest of the children. And that is often based on somebody's interpretation of the way they've interacted with their parents. Not an expert in attachment theory, not someone who's been trained in attachment, not someone who understands the broad concepts that sit around attachment theory, but someone who has a basic working knowledge but unable to really provide a wide version of what attachment theory actually is all about, using only what the department insists as being their version of attachment, which is totally inaccurate and in many cases just simply wrong. We need to find a way of working differently. Now I'm just going to play a short video for you, which was from a news outlet in the UK. And here we have two social workers talking about what is required. Now, one of the social workers, and these I think were the chair of the British Association of Social Workers and another member of the BASW, and it is important to understand here that they're presenting a view which I think is inadequate. Primarily because at one level they're saying more funding is required. I'm not going to dispute that. Certainly more funding is required and it needs to be placed into certain areas. But the fact is that social workers themselves do not talk about the lack of social work training and the lack of skills that are required in order to do the job. No one seems to talk about that. In fact, in Australia, the Australian Association of Social Workers very rarely buy into this issue. It's a primary issue for social workers. More social workers are employed within the child protection system than anywhere else. Yet it's an area which the ASW seems to ignore. And the ASW, as the peak body for social workers, need to take a stand. They need to be able to talk about the training in relation to social workers, the skill set required for social workers, and they need to start advocating for social workers so that social workers can maintain their jobs within the child protection system. What does tend to happen is that social workers will eventually leave. I'll play that video now for you, and I'll discuss it on the other side.
I mean, one of the arguments is that all of this should be being done already. We should be trying to prevent children going into care. We should be trying... There is a staying put policy, for example, that should have allowed Casey to stay with foster family until she's 21 that is not being implemented. Is that a resource thing? Is that the fact that the system is just not working at the moment?
I think it's a bit of both. You know, the system, as we've heard, is desperately under-resourced. Social workers, there are many brilliant professionals really struggling against a system that urgently needs reform. We need to make sure there are enough homes of the right type in the right places for children to live in. That needs national government response, and we have to end the care cliff. We can't be saying to young people, you're out on your own at 18, with 1 in 3 of them then going on to be homeless. I mean, it's not good enough.
The obvious calls are for money and investment, but what about attitude change, finally?
Well, look, I know social workers in England who are dedicated, experienced, able to provide the 5-star service that children need and society expects from us. However, the government has only been funding a 2-star service. That's the problem. So in addition to investment, what we need the government to do is we need more social workers. So we need a national-wide recruitment of social workers. Car mileage needs to be fixed. We need bursary for students. Essentially, we need a government response to be incredibly radical so that we can address this issue once and for all.
So much more to talk about. We're expecting the government response perhaps next week. We'll all be looking at it really, really closely.
So he talks about the 5-star system, but no one ever talks about what a 5-star system is for social workers. What does it mean? What does it look like? As I said before, there are some great social workers working within the system, and I've encountered them. At the moment, I'm working with a client who is working with a supervisor and a social worker, a young social worker, and I think she's fabulous. She knows how to ask the questions, she's respectful, she's great. Still a lot of learning to be done, I think, because she's only new, but she is prepared to use her skills in order to become more effective. And I see that from time to time, but I don't see enough of it. These young social workers do not have the authority to be able to make decisions about what's happening for their families. They also don't have the authority, I think, because the culture will not allow them to have such authority, to talk to and advocate for the families. Often decisions that are made in relation to families are not made by the social workers at the grassroots level. They're made by somebody else who's looked at all this data, negative data normally, and then will make a decision based on risk aversion at the end of this process. We need to be able to have open conversations about what is appropriate and what isn't. The department specifically needs to be able to have conversations with their staff about what they like and what they don't like, what authority they would like to have that they don't have, and social workers should be made aware of the skill sets they do not have that they need to have. They often need additional training. They need experience. Now, you can't expect a young social worker straight out of university to step into a role and have that experience. I can remember last year I had a young social worker contact me who was just fed up with the child protection system because she could hear them saying things that she believed were negative about clients. And she had a value and ethics that she understood being trained as a social worker that was completely at odds with what she was experiencing from her manager and her supervisor. Now, she needed to have a voice, but she found that the louder she cried out, the louder she objected to what was happening, she was ostracised. She was made to feel that she was exceptionally bad. It was clear that she wasn't. Those voices within the child protection system need to be heard. What we need to do is to have an independent body that is maybe appointed by the government, admittedly, because where else would it come from, who has the authority to be able to talk to these social workers and find out what it is that they need. It's also important to be able to work with social workers to find out what skill sets they have and whether or not they're interacting appropriately with clients. My experience is that if you find a way to engage with people, if you find a way to understand what's happening for them, to hear their stories, to empathize with them, you will build a relationship that is likely to produce a good outcome. If you're unable to do that, if you're unable to develop a relationship of trust, then the chances of success are very, very low. I would find that very few cases I work with, the clients would be able to tell me that their relationship is a good one with the social worker. And the social worker comes from a very sceptical area anyway. I mean, the fact is that they've removed children, therefore there's going to be some negative attitudes towards you. But that's a barrier that can be overcome if the client or the parent believes that they're heard, that what they say is taken seriously, and that their deficits are not thrown back at them continually. So there are ways by which this can be rectified. Having a body that will be able to provide appropriate supervision, to be able to do appropriate assessments of staff, who has a distinct understanding as to what social work principles and ethics are all about. If that could be established within the child protection system in a way that appears to be, and hopefully is, independent, and that there are people who are prepared to listen to what those independent people have to say, then that could make a difference. I've been a social worker for over 30 years now. I think I have a fair understanding as to what social work is supposed to be, the way it is supposed to be represented. I have been advocating for these issues for years. The time has come now to be able to talk about them, to suggest that the RSW has a voice, that an independent body be established to be able to evaluate social workers as they work, to allow social workers to be able to say what they actually need to say about clients, as opposed to having someone else above them make those decisions. For social workers to be able to develop the skill sets that they require in order to do the job appropriately. To abandon attachment theory so that it isn't used as a tool against most parents. We need to change the system, but the system will not change just by throwing money at it. The system will not change by just putting in programs that are poorly run and where social workers can't do their job. The system will not change as long as social workers has massive, massive caseloads. All social workers should have no more than 10, as I said earlier. The volume and the expectancy around that volume in relation to the amount of work to be done is immense. And I accept that for many social workers, that is overpowering. When one thinks of the number of people that you're working with, the reports that need to be written, the affidavits that need to be written for court, the assessment and the accumulation of information in relation to those families, the version of who these people are based on your own personal assessment of them is important. It's integral in terms of working out an appropriate outcome. But if you don't have the skill set and you don't have the ability to be able to make those assessments appropriately because you have a poor relationship with the parents, is not going to produce a good outcome for the children. So we need to do better, and we need to start doing it now.